what do I usually do when I speak at these things? I've spoken at a lot of these Nullify Now things. When you write a book called Nullification, well, you know, you get the invite from me. Now, I've had, gosh, I guess I've written 11 books, and for a while it was every time a baby would be born, I had a book coming out. Then we couldn't keep up with my publishing pace, but I've slowed down, and yet now the baby production's going back up again, so who knows how it's all going to even out ultimately. But I had a New York Times bestseller, or 2 of them, but one of them was called The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. That's what we're on next. Before that time, I was some guy who wrote books that other professors would read, and you know, if they would sell 100 copies, they were considered an academic bestseller. And you know, little did the publisher know I bought 50 of them just to bump the numbers up. So for that book to really take off, it really sort of took me by surprise. And the nature of the attacks that I suffered, I'm telling you this not out of narcissism, but because there is a lesson here. The nature of the attacks was very revealing. Because I was not attacked for saying things that were wrong. I was attacked for saying things. So, for example, the book came out late 2004, and the New York Times in January the following year wrote not a review in the book review section, as you might expect, but a signed editorial on the editorial page about just how dangerous this book is. And they proceeded to list some of the claims that I made, none of which they refuted. Can you believe he says this? And he said that president didn't do any good, and this one was a bum, and he supports nullification? So in other words, they never said, and here's why he's wrong to say these things. It was crime enough that I had even raised these points. A peon like me isn't even entitled to a reputation. So what do you suppose happened the week after I was attacked in the New York Times? How do you suppose my sales went? So the second time I had a New York Times bestseller was 2009, a book called Meltdown, A Free Market Look at the Financial Crisis. How do you think the New York Times handled that one? Ignored it completely. Oh, but that makes me happy. You know, every week they had to put it on the list, they're gritting their teeth. And now to imagine that, well, gosh, I mean, I could still be of sort of, my wife could still be of childbearing age, and the New York Times could be out of business. Like, it's that close. You imagine that we're living at a time like this. Is amazing, right? It's a glorious moment to be alive, everybody. Many of our ancestors would have killed to live at a time like this. And it's our good fortune to be here. Well, now, it's not all happiness, though. It's not all collapsing New York Times and falling profitability for the Washington Post. It's not all good news. There's plenty of bad news as well. You already know that. I'm not going to bother you by listing it. But I would say the classic example of this would be, if we're looking back at the 20th century and constitutional interpretation and the Supreme Court, what we'll find is that from about the 1940s down to the 1990s, the Supreme Court really couldn't seem to find much of anything unconstitutional. Oh, they scoured everything. They couldn't find anything unconstitutional. Then 1995 came along. And we had this case, United States versus Lopez. And this was about the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. And the argument that was being made here by the defendant was, this is an unconstitutional law. The federal government has no authority over establishing rules for guns near schools. And in fact, at the time that this law was passed in 1990, there were already such laws in 40 states. So it was superfluous for the federal government to be involved anyway. Well, here's how the government tried to defend itself before the Supreme Court. They argued, no, it is constitutional for the federal government to establish gun-free school zones. And here's why. The Constitution authorizes the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. Well, if kids are worried when they're studying that maybe there's a gun nearby, they won't be able to learn as effectively. And if they don't learn as effectively, they're going to be dumber. And if they're dumber, they're not going to be able to produce as much. And if they don't produce as much, then interstate commerce will be diminished. So that was too much even for the normally indulgent Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, we've really turned a blind eye to an awful lot in the 20th century, but that we just can't take. Like, that's too much. And so we got commentaries from a lot of conservatives who said, the counter-revolution is on, right? The Supreme Court struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990. This is it, man. Off we... No, that was pretty much it. After that, they just carried on in their way. Like, that was it. But that type of reasoning, the federal government fully expected to win that case. Because they've been engaging in that type of reasoning all along. I mean, some of you know the Wickard versus Filburn case, 1942, right? People groan. Isn't that awesome? We have an educated group here that they hear Wickard versus Filburn and they think, oh, what an example of jurisprudence. I love you people, right? Fantastic. But those of you who don't know, now you're afraid to say, right? So I'll let you all in, so then later you can joke about it. But that case involved a farmer, and he was consuming wheat that he had grown on his own property for his own consumption and for the consumption of his livestock. And the federal government said they were allowed to regulate that. And he said, I really don't think so. I don't see how this could be interstate commerce. It never left my property. And part of their answer was, well, it is interstate commerce because the fact that you consumed your own wheat and thereby abstained from purchasing wheat in interstate commerce means that you influence interstate commerce. So in other words, merely it's just standing there and surviving affects interstate commerce. So I sometimes, I start off telling you about my kids, not just to let you know what's going on in the Woods family, but also because I've sometimes wondered, along these grounds, couldn't they just as easily regulate human reproduction on the same lines? I mean, the more children you have, the more they're going to engage in interstate commerce. So I feel like I got to tell my kids, don't produce anything, right? And then maybe they... So that's the situation that we're in. And then, I open up this book, Nullification, recounting the Nancy Pelosi story about Obamacare, when they asked, we're just kind of curious, is there anything you had in mind constitutionally when you did this? We just want to know. We're just curious. And her response was the laughter and then, are you serious? And then they move on to the next question. So the Constitution went from being like the foundation stone of the country to being like the butt of a joke. That's where it's gone. That's where we are, and that's why we're talking about something like nullification. So what I usually do at an event like this is I give the constitutional case, which is very strong, by the way. The constitutional case for nullification is very strong. I give a constitutional case, I respond to objections. I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to take a different tack, partly because some of you people creep me out a little bit. You watch all my YouTubes and you already know everything I'm going to say. All my jokes and everything. I feel like a stand-up comic in the age of YouTube. What am I supposed to do? Come up with new material every night? What is this? So I'm going to do something a little different. But if you want that stuff, well, okay, obviously I have this book and it costs a lot of money to raise 5 kids, so in case you feel like buying one. But I also have this stuff available online. So the one sort of takeaway from today is I'm going to give you some website names to jot down with free stuff. If you're like me, you're a cheapskate and you like free stuff. Well, today is your lucky day, my friends. The first thing I'm going to refer you to is my frequently asked questions on nullification. NullificationFAQ.com. That stands for frequently asked questions. NullificationFAQ.com. And that deals in part with the, is it constitutional? What about the supremacy clause? And so on and on. And it also deals with common objections. My super duper fundamental basic overview of nullification is at statenullification.com. Isn't it? These are easy to remember. NullificationFAQ.com, statenullification.com. Okay.